The search for Nancy Guthrie continues in Tucson. The 84-year-old vanished January 31st. She was reported missing the next day after she failed to show up for church. But nearly 2 months later, the case seems to be running cold. Much of the investigation has been under a microscope, and now there's a lot of focus on Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos over his handling of the investigation and for resume discrepancies.
52 days, and still no sign of Nancy Guthrie. An 84-year-old woman vanishes from her own home in the Catalina foothills, and what investigators have uncovered since then has only made the situation more unsettling. Because this wasn't a chaotic break-in. It wasn't loud. It wasn't rushed. If anything, it felt controlled. And that's exactly what's been bothering people from the very beginning. In the early hours of February 1st, something happened inside Nancy's home, something quiet enough that no immediate alarm spread through the neighborhood, but serious enough that within hours, law enforcement would be flooding the area. A missing persons case, but not the kind you typically see, because almost immediately there were signs this wasn't random. Investigators would later confirm that Nancy's disappearance was being treated as a targeted abduction. That word, targeted, changes everything. It suggests planning. It suggests intent. It suggests that whoever did this didn't just stumble onto that house by accident. And then there was the footage. A doorbell camera captured a figure that night, masked, unidentifiable, moving with a level of calm that didn't match the severity of what was happening. No visible panic, no hesitation, just movement. But here's where things start to feel off. The individual wasn't just masked, they were carrying a distinctive backpack, not something random, not something easily overlooked, a detail that investigators would later circle back to again and again. Because when a crime is impulsive, details tend to be messy, unpredictable, sloppy. This didn't feel like that. And as the hours passed, the situation escalated quickly. Local authorities were joined by federal agents. The FBI stepped in. Search efforts expanded. The quiet neighborhood turned into an active investigation zone. And yet, despite the urgency, there was something missing. A clear trail. No immediate suspect. No confirmed direction. Just questions. And time working against everyone.
Senior national correspondent Brian Enton joins us live. So Brian, the department actually entered a nearly unanimous no confidence vote against the sheriff last month.
Yeah, that was a big moment. The Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos, he's really been under scrutiny for his handling of the Nancy Guthrie case since almost the beginning. It's now been 52 days since Nancy went missing. Still no arrests, still no solid leads or suspects that we know of. The Board of Supervisors has expressed frustration with the sheriff. They've got an item on their agenda today to discuss what they are calling recently reported issues concerning Sheriff Nanos' work history and apparent related false statements and related personnel, management, internal affairs investigations. And the meeting is happening right now.
Because Nancy wasn't just missing, she was vulnerable. At 84, she relied on daily heart medication. Every passing hour without it raised the stakes in a way that investigators couldn't ignore. That's when the case began to shift from concerning to critical. And while authorities worked to piece together what happened inside that home, attention quickly turned outward. Who would target her? Why her? And how did they know enough to carry this out so precisely? Those questions didn't just stay within law enforcement circles. They started spreading. Online, in media discussions, among people following the case closely. And then another layer began to form. Quiet at first, almost hesitant, some began to question whether this really was a local crime at all. Because the more details that surfaced, the less it felt like something simple. A masked individual, a controlled entry, no immediate trace, no clear motive. It didn't fit neatly. And that's when a theory, still unconfirmed, started gaining attention. What if Nancy Guthrie wasn't just taken, but moved, far from Tucson, possibly out of reach? At first, it sounded like speculation pushed too far, the kind of idea that surfaces early in high-profile cases and fades just as quickly. But this one didn't disappear. In fact, it started coming up more often. Voices with law enforcement backgrounds, some retired, some experienced in organized crime cases, began hinting at something larger, not claiming it outright, but raising the possibility. A possibility that felt uncomfortable to even consider, that this wasn't just an isolated abduction, but something more coordinated, and potentially something that didn't end in Arizona. Now, to be clear, there has been no official confirmation of this. No agency has publicly stated that Nancy was taken across the border. No direct evidence has been released to support that claim. But here's what makes the theory difficult to ignore. It aligns just enough with what we know. a targeted operation, a suspect who came prepared, an execution that didn't leave behind immediate answers. Those aren't typical of random acts, and as investigators continued their work, one thing became increasingly clear. Whoever was responsible had a plan. The real question is, how far did that plan go? Because if this was something organized, something premeditated at a higher level, then what happened that night might not have ended when Nancy left that house. It may have only been the beginning. And that raises a chilling possibility. Was this simply a calculated local abduction, or the first step in something more deliberate? The night Nancy Guthrie vanished may not have been the beginning. It may have been the final step of something that had already been set in motion weeks earlier. Because as investigators dug deeper into the timeline, they didn't just focus on February 1st. Instead, they went backward. And what they found raised even more questions. Roughly 3 weeks before the abduction, around January 11th, detectives began zeroing in on activity in and around Nancy's neighborhood. Not random activity, not background noise. Something specific enough that weeks later, they were still asking for surveillance footage from that exact date. And that alone is unusual, because investigators don't typically rewind a case unless they believe something important was missed the first time. So the question becomes, what happened on January 11th? That's where things start to feel different. Footage from the area reportedly showed a figure, again, not clearly identifiable, but similar in behavior to the person seen the night Nancy disappeared. The movements, the timing, the presence. It suggested something unsettling, that whoever showed up on February 1st may have already been there before, watching, learning, waiting. And this is where the case begins to shift from a single event into a possible operation. Because if someone was scouting the property weeks in advance, that changes the entire narrative. It means this wasn't impulsive, it wasn't reactive, it was studied.
I spoke with the former chief deputy who worked with Nanos for almost 40 years, who's now actually turned on him and claims that Nanos has not handled the Guthrie investigation properly and did not coordinate ground searches fast enough.
I believe some of the searches that began within a few days after the fact were reactionary and were pressured by public opinion and were, we forgot to do this and we should do it now. Was it appropriate at that time? I guess at some point it needed to be done. Should it have been done sooner? Absolutely. Absolutely. What I'm trying to suggest to you, Brian, is that Chris is not interested in other perspectives or other opinions or somebody trying to help him.
So this meeting in Pima County, it is ongoing right now. It's going to be interesting to see what comes of it because the sheriff is obviously elected, so they can't just vote to fire him. He's elected by the people. There is, however, this recall being organized where a special election could be held to try to vote him out. The sheriff, meanwhile, Sheriff Nanos, has said all along, really, that he handled the investigation the best way possible and that he stands by his decisions. Nicole?
All right, so in the midst of all of that and everything that the sheriff is dealing with, Nancy Guthrie is still missing. Are there any updates on the search for her?
Well, the sheriff has said that it is not a cold case, and that's what we've heard from sources within the investigation, so that's good. We know that the FBI has been back out in the neighborhood following up on leads, that there's still DNA testing happening behind the scenes. So I think it is fair to say it's not cold because there's a lot going on. In terms of whether there's a good lead or an arrest imminent, we don't know of anything like that at this point, Nicole.
All right, Brian Inton live with the very latest. Thank you.
And then another detail surfaced. Investigators began examining a nearby vacant home. At first glance, it might not seem significant, just another empty property in a quiet neighborhood. But under closer scrutiny, it started to look like something else entirely. A vantage point. A place where someone could observe Nancy's routine without being noticed. A place to watch when lights turned on, when they turned off, when she was alone. And that raises a difficult question. If someone was using that home to monitor her, how long had they been doing it? Days, weeks, or longer? Because surveillance takes patience, it takes coordination, it takes intent, and it rarely involves just one person. That's exactly why some experts have suggested this may not have been carried out by a single individual. Instead, they point toward the possibility of multiple people, each playing a role. One watching, one preparing, one executing. And suddenly, the entire situation begins to look structured, almost like a system. But here's where things get even more complicated, because when you combine pre-surveillance, a potential staging location, and a clean execution, it starts to resemble something that goes beyond a typical local crime. It starts to resemble organization. And with that, the earlier theory begins to resurface, quietly at first, but more persistently now. Some have begun connecting these details to the idea that this wasn't just a targeted abduction, but part of something larger, something coordinated beyond a single neighborhood, possibly even beyond a single city. And that's where the speculation takes a sharper turn, because in certain types of organized operations, especially those involving multiple individuals and careful planning, movement becomes part of the strategy, not just taking someone, but relocating them, quickly, quietly, and potentially far away from where the investigation begins. Now, again, there is no confirmed evidence that Nancy Guthrie was taken out of Arizona. Authorities have not stated that she crossed any border, but the structure of what we're seeing has led some to ask that question anyway. Because if this level of planning was involved, what was the endgame? At first, the answer seemed obvious: money. Shortly after the abduction, multiple ransom notes were sent to the media outlets, not law enforcement directly, but the media. That alone raised eyebrows. The demands were specific: $4 million in Bitcoin, later escalating to $6 million, and the messages included details that were not publicly known, references to items inside Nancy's home, including a floodlight, her Apple Watch, even descriptions of what she had been wearing, details that suggested whoever wrote those messages knew more than they should. And for a moment, it seemed like the case had direction: a ransom, a demand, a possible negotiation. But then, something didn't follow the pattern. There was no proof of life, no follow-up that moved things forward. Deadlines came and went, and nothing changed. Which brings us to a critical question. If this was truly about money, why didn't it progress like a typical ransom case? Why escalate the demand and then disappear? Why reveal specific details, but never provide confirmation? And perhaps most importantly, was the ransom ever the real objective? Because when you step back and look at the timeline, the early surveillance, the potential staging location, and the clean execution, and then the breakdown of the ransom narrative, it creates a gap between what this looks like and what it actually is. And that gap is exactly where speculation begins to grow. Because if the ransom was a distraction, then what was the plan really about? And if this was organized from the start, then February 1st wasn't the beginning of the crime. It was the moment everything finally came together.
Investigators say they have evidence, but none of it tells a complete story. More than 7 weeks into the disappearance of Nancy Guthrie, the case hasn't gone cold, not even close. In fact, according to officials, there are still active leads being worked, still pieces being processed. And yet, the deeper they go, the more complicated it becomes. Because some of the strongest evidence in this case also raises the most questions. Take the DNA. Authorities have confirmed they recovered what they describe as workable DNA from the scene. Not just a trace, but usable material. The kind that can be analyzed, compared, even potentially traced through genetic databases. At first, that sounds like a breakthrough. But here's the part that doesn't sit right. It's not a single clean profile. It's mixed, multiple contributors, possibly overlapping, and in at least one instance, investigators believe the DNA may have come from a glove, not direct skin contact, which immediately raises a question. If someone took the time to plan this, to scout the home, to move carefully and avoid detection, why leave behind DNA at all? It's a contradiction that's difficult to ignore. Too organized to be careless, but not clean enough to be invisible. And that contradiction doesn't stop there, because while forensic teams have shifted their focus toward lab analysis, even exploring genetic genealogy as a potential path forward, the case itself hasn't moved in a clear direction publicly. There's no named suspect, no confirmed identity tied to that DNA, just the sense that investigators are holding on to something, but not enough to act. And then there's the ransom. In the early days, it seemed like the central piece of the puzzle. Messages sent to multiple media outlets demanding millions in Bitcoin, specific instructions, escalating amounts, details that weren't public. It felt deliberate, calculated. But then it stalled. No proof of life was ever provided, no verified communication that advanced beyond those initial messages. And despite the urgency of the situation, nothing materialized from those demands. The deadlines passed, silence followed. And just like that, the ransom narrative started to fall apart. Which brings us back to the question that keeps resurfacing. Was it ever real? Because if those messages came from the actual perpetrator, why abandon the process entirely? Why reveal knowledge of the crime but never capitalize on it? And if they didn't come from the perpetrator, then who sent them? Someone trying to interfere? Someone trying to insert themselves into the case? Or something even more calculated, designed to shift attention in a very specific direction? And this is where the tone of the investigation began to change, because recently a statement attributed to investigators has added a much darker layer to the case, a suggestion, not officially confirmed in full detail, but widely discussed, that the individuals responsible may now have nothing left to bargain with.
That one line carries weight, because if true, it reframes everything. It suggests that the absence of proof of life wasn't a delay, it wasn't strategy, it may have been final, and suddenly the ransom silence makes a different kind of sense. But at the same time, it introduces an entirely new problem. If there's nothing left to negotiate for, then what was the purpose of the abduction in the first place? And this is where the earlier theory, the one that never quite went away, starts to push back into focus. Because if this wasn't about money, and if it wasn't impulsive, and if it involved planning, coordination, and possibly multiple individuals, then some believe the objective may have been something else entirely, something that didn't require a prolonged negotiation, something that may have ended much earlier than anyone initially thought. And for those who have been following the case closely, this is where the speculation becomes more intense. The idea that Nancy may have been moved quickly, removed from the area, possibly beyond the reach of local investigation. Now, to be clear, there is still no direct evidence confirming that, no official statement placing her outside of Arizona, no verified connection to any larger organization. But the pattern continues to raise questions, because in cases where operations appear structured, where roles may be divided, where timelines are controlled, movement becomes part of the equation. And if movement happened early, it would explain something else that doesn't quite fit: the lack of trace, no confirmed sightings, no clear path forward, just fragments of evidence that don't quite align. And still, there are contradictions, because if this were something larger, something organized at a higher level, you might expect even fewer mistakes, cleaner execution, less forensic residue, more control over the narrative. But that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing pieces that suggest planning alongside elements that feel incomplete. And that tension is exactly what's keeping the case suspended where it is now, between two possibilities. One, that this was a targeted local act that hasn't yet been unraveled, and the other, that it was something more complex, more coordinated, and possibly already finished long before the investigation could catch up. Every clue points somewhere, but never in the same direction, and that's what makes this case so difficult to define and so hard to ignore.
After 52 days, investigators still don't have the answer everyone is asking. What really happened to Nancy Guthrie? Because when you lay out everything we know, every detail, every development, every theory, the case doesn't form a clear picture. It fractures. On one side, you have the facts: a targeted abduction in the early hours of February 1st, signs of possible surveillance weeks before, a masked individual moving with purpose, a nearby vacant home that may have been used to observe, ransom messages demanding millions, then going silent, and DNA, present but not pointing cleanly to a single suspect. Individually, each of these details suggests progress, but together they don't align. And that's where the uncertainty begins to grow. Because if this was a simple crime, even a calculated one, you would expect some level of resolution by now, a suspect identified, a direction confirmed, something concrete. Instead, what we have is a pattern that feels incomplete, and into that gap, a theory has continued to surface, one that even now remains unproven: the idea that Nancy Guthrie may not even be in the same place she was taken from, that she may have been moved, possibly far beyond Tucson, possibly beyond state lines, and in some versions of the theory, beyond the border entirely. It's a claim that hasn't been confirmed by any official agency. No public evidence has been released to support it. No direct link to any cartel or organized cross-border group has been established. And yet, the theory persists. Because for some, it explains what the facts cannot: the level of planning, the possibility of multiple individuals involved, the sudden collapse of the ransom narrative, and perhaps most notably, that chilling suggestion that there may now be nothing left to bargain with. When you connect those points, a certain interpretation begins to form, not proven, not verified, but difficult for some to ignore, that this may not have been about negotiation at all, that whatever the objective was, it may have already been completed. And if that's the case, then the silence we're seeing now isn't confusion, it's the absence of anything left to say. But then there's the other side, because for every detail that seems to support that possibility, there's another that challenges it. No confirmed movement across any border, no surveillance footage placing her outside the area, no financial trail tied to a larger network, no claim of responsibility, and perhaps most importantly, no official confirmation from investigators that this case extends beyond what they've publicly stated, which forces the question back into focus. If this were something that large, something that coordinated, wouldn't there be more signs, more precision, more control, fewer inconsistencies? Because what we're seeing isn't a clean operation, it's a mix of signals: careful planning but imperfect execution,
Intentional movement, but no clear destination. A strong start to a ransom narrative, followed by complete silence. And that contradiction keeps pulling the case in two different directions. One possibility that this was a highly targeted act carried out locally by individuals who knew exactly what they were doing, but haven't yet been identified. And another that this was part of something more complex, something structured in a way that doesn't leave obvious traces behind. Two paths, both incomplete, both unresolved. And as those theories continue to circulate, something else has been building in the background: frustration. Public scrutiny has intensified, questions about the pace of the investigation, debates about whether critical time was lost, online discussions pushing different narratives, some grounded, others far less so. But through all of it, one voice has remained consistent: the family. In recent days, they've spoken again, thanking the community, asking for continued attention, emphasizing that even the smallest detail could matter. Because from their perspective, this isn't about theories, it's about finding Nancy. And that contrast is hard to ignore. While speculation expands, their reality stays the same: waiting, hoping, holding on to the possibility that somewhere, someone knows something they haven't yet realized is important. And that brings everything back to where it started: a targeted abduction, a carefully executed plan, and a disappearance that even now refuses to resolve. So what really happened? Was this a local operation that has somehow avoided detection for nearly 2 months? Was the ransom ever real, or just a layer meant to mislead? Or is there something more to this case? Something that extends beyond what we can see, beyond what's been confirmed, and possibly beyond where anyone has been looking? Right now, there are no clear answers, only patterns, only questions, and a theory that continues to divide those following the case: that somewhere along the way, Nancy Guthrie didn't just disappear. She was taken, somewhere no one has been able to trace. Maybe nearby, maybe far away, or maybe somewhere in between those two possibilities. Because until something breaks, a name, a location, a piece of evidence that finally connects everything, this case remains suspended in uncertainty. And the truth, whatever it is still out there, unconfirmed, unproven, and getting harder to reach with every passing day.